what I would like to talk about now is some attempts to try to develop a creation theory that has less conflict with science. We could talk a little bit about the nature of science. Science is an endeavor to discover laws of nature, laws of physics, if you please, without any appeal to any supernatural cause. In science, if you're to suggest that God or some other intelligent designer has caused something, you'll be thrown out. Science excludes the possibility, thank you, of any consideration of intelligent design. And many, I'm not sure whether it's the majority, but many of the most vocal scientists are materialists by philosophy. In other words, they're atheists. And just the idea that there might be some kind of intelligent design in nature is so repulsive to atheists that even to suggest any kind of design or purpose in nature is met with hostility of an intensity that it's difficult to explain just in scientific terms. The level of hostility against the idea of a creator is so strong that one suspects there's a lot more to it than just some intellectual or philosophical idea. This has to do with very important concepts in the lives of these scientists. And so, to try to get along with the scientists, many of whom are atheists, some Christians have tried to incorporate long ages of time into their creation theory. And I'd like to take a look at some of those attempts. And there's a reason that I feel this is an important exercise. Can we incorporate long ages of time into a biblical record? When we think of creation, we think of some intelligent cause acting with a purpose, and most people think of the biblical story. Ron Numbers is one of the historians of science. He wrote a book called The Creationists. That book did not describe the activities of long-age creationists. In his book, the meaning of the creationists is those who hold a six-day creation view. Those are the creationists. And it's in that sense that I will be using that term today, although we'll have to modify that at times. There's several models of origins that are sometimes called models of creation, but I think it's better to use a different term. Now, there are some ideas that are brought about in the discussion on origins, but they are not models of origins. For example, some have suggested that Genesis 1 is poetry and not history. Well, suppose you adopt that position. What does it tell you about origins? It tells you nothing about origins. All it does is try to take Genesis and move it out of the way, and then you develop some other theory. But the idea that Genesis might be poetry is not a creation model or an origins model. It's a model of interpreting Scripture, a hermeneutical model. Likewise, the temple theology model just published here a couple of years ago, the idea that the days of creation are not days of creating something new, but days of blessing. That tells us nothing at all about how things began. It only tells us that we ought to interpret Genesis in a certain way. So I would like to make sure that it's clear that those kinds of approaches to Genesis do not constitute models of origins. They are hermeneutical models, not creation models. No, this is an example. This is an example of a hermeneutical model, the literary framework hypothesis. This is the idea that Earth forms what's called a lower register, and heaven forms an upper register, and the two are related in some way, some kind of analogy. And Genesis is talking about what God's doing up in heaven, and God is doing some kind of symbolic thing in the 6 days of creation, but it doesn't tell us anything about what's actually happening on the earth. That's one model called the literary framework hypothesis. But this is not a model of what's actually happening. It's a model of what Genesis means. And there are some difficulties. Some of the difficulties have been pointed out. The literary framework hypothesis separates God's actions from the world, which seems to be a useless idea. It's not a proposal to explain our origins. It's just a negation, trying to say that Genesis doesn't mean anything. It has no biblical support, and it has no scientific support. It's simply something somebody made up. So that's an example of a hermeneutical model. Now, when it comes to models of origins, there are two classes of models. One class is a model in which God directly acts to create something immediately, perhaps de novo, but perhaps ex nihilo, but not necessarily ex nihilo. He may create, for example, Adam from the dust, but Adam is certainly something new. There was no Adam before that. There was only dust. So that's a new creation. So that's one kind of model. And biblical creation, of course, fits in that group, and so do long-age creations. There are some models in which God creates repeatedly, but he's creating. Like you might have the Garden of Eden, you could have the Garden of Jurassic Park, and you got the Garden of Ediacara or whatever. The other kind of a model is when God creates gradually through some evolutionary process, a continuous process, such as theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. So there are two groups of models. First of all, let's look at the biblical creation based on an interpretation of Genesis as describing real, historical, literal events, but we wouldn't hold Genesis to speak in terms of technical language. The Bible itself is written from the standpoint of what things look like. The kind of conversation that we would normally have. We say, the sun set at such and such a time. Now, we know that the sun didn't set. We know that the earth turned so that the sun went out of range of our view. But we still call it a sunset because that's what it looks like and everybody understands it. If we think of the Bible as speaking to us in that way, using language of the common people and just the way things look to be, and the way people would understand it, I think that we will be okay in understanding what the Scripture is telling us. The major tenets of biblical creation, I've just gone through those already. By fiat, at the beginning there were many kinds. You notice on day 3, plants were created. And there were different kinds of plants created in that day. So there's a variety already. Day 5, the air is filled with a variety of things. There's a plurality. It says, let the air be filled with living creatures. It's not just one kind of creature and then evolution, but it's a diversity there right at the very beginning in day 5. And likewise in the water, let the water swarm with living creatures. Likewise on day 6, let the earth bring forth living creatures. Then it names certain groups, so that the idea in the biblical story is that during creation week, or at the end of creation week, there was a diversity of things, not just one evolutionary ancestor, but a diversity. Now, no doubt there have been some lineages descended from those originally created things, but they're not all descended from just one ancestor. Humans, and then no violence. Now, there are some scientific difficulties with biblical creation. It's based entirely on supernatural activity and as supernaturally revealed. So it's certainly not within the scope of science, because science does not consider any supernatural process. They look only at natural things. Materialist scientists object to the dependence on the supernatural since they deny the existence of the supernatural. And biblical creation relies on processes with greater rate and scope than we observe today, often associated with a supernaturally caused global flood. Now, technically speaking, this is not creation, this is the geologic column, but they're linked together, so perhaps it'd be better to separate them out. But at least in the way God works, his activities are often accomplish something that can also be accomplished naturally, but at a much faster rate or a much broader scope than we normally see. For example, when Jesus turned water to wine, that is a process that can occur gradually. The grape plant can absorb water, add some various chemicals and flavoring, produce grape, and you get grape juice out of it. That's a natural process. Jesus, in changing the water to wine, started with a material that's available and ended with a material that's familiar. But he short-circuited the whole process, and so instead of taking months, it took only a few moments. So the rate at which God created, in that sense, could be much greater than today. The theological problems with biblical creation, well, I would say that probably the theology is very good. The Bible describes the Creator God as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, eternal, infinite, personal, and good. I don't see any theological problems with that. It's a great picture of a wonderful God. The Bible describes God as the best possible God, one who loves, who values free will, and offers forgiveness and restoration. There's no better God than that. In fact, I don't think there's any other God that has been proposed who is that attractive. Okay, let's look now at some alternatives. Some people are bothered that science doesn't like this theory. So what does science suggest to us? Well, the differences in creation stories are usually related to the interpretation of the word day, in Hebrew yom, and 6 days. Some people say these are literal 24-hour days, and they occur in the sequence given in Genesis. Some say, no, they're not literal days, but they still occur in the sequence given in Genesis. They're figurative days, but in sequence, so they're day ages. And others say, well, no, they're neither literal nor sequential, it's just a kind of a figure of speech. Let's take a look at some of these ideas. The first one is what's called the active gap theory. The active gap idea is that God created one time, a long time ago, and Satan corrupted that creation, and the fossil record accumulated during the time Satan and God were battling it out over who was going to control this world. And then at some point, God stepped in and destroyed the whole thing, and then that all happened before Genesis. And then what happened from then on starts with Genesis. So you have a creation in Genesis 1, a creation in 6 days, as described in Genesis. Well, there are some difficulties with this theory. First of all, there isn't any biblical support for it. The Bible doesn't tell us about any battle on this earth between God and Satan. Secondly, it predicts that at some point there's a destructive layer, that the fossil record should end at a certain point with a destructive layer, and then any fossils above that point should be the record of God's, the animals that God created. Below that point would be the animals that Satan created. So you should see an abrupt change in the fossil record. There is no such gap in the fossil record. And if we try to force it through anyway, then you have the curious situation that God destroyed Satan's behavior, Satan's world, because it was corrupted, but when God created, it looked just the same. If there's no gap, then what God created and what Satan created look just the same. So it's kind of an odd theory. In my view, this theory, although it has some very appealing features, it doesn't work. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. Then there's another theory that maybe instead of just one creation in the past, before Genesis, there is a series of them, a whole bunch of, we call it multiple gaps, if you wish, the one form of ancient creation. And following the same sequence as in Genesis, that is, the plants first, then the sea and air animals, and then finally the land animals, ending with humans. Now, this model has no valid biblical support at all, and the fossil sequence conflicts with the Genesis sequence. We'll come back to that because that same problem applies to the day-age theory, the idea that the days of creation were indefinite ages, but they occur in sequence. There's a first age of light, the second age of atmosphere, the third age of land and vegetation. This has no valid biblical support either, and the fossil sequence actually conflicts with the Genesis creation sequence. For example, in the fossil sequence, the first things you see are marine creatures, other than algae, which aren't mentioned in Scripture. But of the things that are mentioned in Genesis, Genesis starts with land plants and fruit-bearing trees, whereas in the fossil sequence, you don't get land plants first, and you don't get fruit-bearing trees until way high in the sequence, way late in the geological sequence. Water creatures and flying creatures, here you have water creatures, and you have land creatures, the insects. Land insects come before flying insects, and land vertebrates come before flying vertebrates. Birds, of course, are pretty much all flying. And so the only thing really in common, the only thing that's similar is that humans are last in both cases. But aside from that, there's considerable conflict between the sequence of fossils and the sequence of creation. And so one has to conclude, I think, that this is not a good explanation. It founders on the fossil sequence, at least. Then there's another idea. It has a variety of names. I'm calling it the serial creation, that is, a series of creations. Bernard Ramm developed this theory and called it progressive creation. I don't like that term because I hear it used for more than one idea, and so to me it's not clear what you mean by progressive creation unless you specify it. So I'll call this a series of creations, and that there are gaps in the fossil record. This indicates that there are different creations. Where there's continuity, that indicates that there's time between creations. And the sequence, instead of following the Genesis sequence, the sequence is whatever the fossil record tells us. Well, first of all, the problems with this theory are it's completely conjectural. It's just made up. There's no theoretical underpinning for it. It has actually no independent substance. It's just take the fossil record and divide it into creations, and that's all you have. So it's really nothing. There's no way to support it. It involves inconsistent biblical exegesis, which I will give you a quotation involving that shortly. It also involves serial mass destructions, because not only do new kinds of organisms appear throughout the fossil record, but there are several horizons where there's a huge destruction, not necessarily complete destruction, no, but mass extinction, they're called in evolutionary thinking. As far as science is concerned, just to say that take the fossil record and say God did this, God did this, God did this, God did this, you might just as well say there was a flood and God did it this way. It's the same idea. Scientifically, it has nothing at all to recommend it. Howard Van Til, a physics teacher at Calvin College, now retired, I'm not even sure if he's still living, he was an elderly fellow, he became a theistic evolutionist, and in doing so, he criticized old Earth creationists in this way. Old Earth special creationism, by its choice to accept the scientifically derived timetable for cosmic history, in other words, long ages, is in the exceedingly awkward position of attempting to interpret some of what Genesis says as episodes of special creation, as historical particulars, but treating the narrative 7-day timetable as being figurative. In other words, he's saying, this is really a strange way to interpret Scripture, to take a story and take parts of it and say these are real, and other parts and say those aren't real. It's kind of inconsistent, to say the least. And Howard Van Til kind of pointed that out, kind of poked his finger in their eye. Kenneth Miller is a molecular biologist at Brown University, wrote the book Finding Darwin's God, which in my view is not a helpful book, but has had some influence. But he kind of represents the antagonism toward intelligent design, although he himself is a Catholic and believes that God exists. So this is not an atheist criticizing this. This is I guess you could call him a deist. Intelligent design, and by that he means long age creation, does a terrible disservice to God by casting him as a magician who periodically creates and creates and then creates again throughout the geologic ages. Now, I don't agree with Kenneth Miller on this point, to call someone who creates a magician, but more important is the second part of this quote. Why did this magician, in order to produce the contemporary world, find it necessary to create and destroy, create and destroy, create and destroy creatures, habitats, and ecosystems millions of times over? So you can see the kind of difficulties faced by this sort of theory. It doesn't make God look very good. So let's move on now to the gradual creation, if you want to call them that. I prefer to call them evolutionary models or theistic evolutionary models, but even theistic evolution is not a single theory. There are at least 3 different forms of this idea, that the basic idea is that evolution is what happened, but God had an influence on it. The first form, and the difference between these theories is how God's influence was exerted. In one case, we have through natural law, that when God initiated the Big Bang, he set up the laws of nature so that human beings would naturally result without him having to do anything about it. Just the laws of nature would bring it about. A second form, that's basically a deist. I mean, that's pretty close to deism. A second one is that God does influence things, but he does it in ways that we can't tell. And one of the favorite ways here is through quantum uncertainty, perhaps. This kind of tends toward God being in the nature itself. It tends toward pantheism. And those who are in pantheistic ideas will probably accept some form of this. And then the third one is through God as a divine tinkerer. But what we mean by a tinkerer is someone who's always adjusting things, like a young man who's just gotten his first car and he's trying to adjust the carburetor. And we don't do that so much anymore. Cars run on computers. But in the olden days, you used to be able to change the parts of it, put chrome-covered parts on it, and adjust this and that and see how it works. And some see God as constantly playing with the animals to see what he can produce. Well, first, let's take the one of what Howard Van Til is the one who proposed the name fully gifted theory, the same man that I quoted from earlier. The idea here is that God put into nature, into the natural laws, just the natural tendencies to evolve. And that God does not need to intervene at all in nature because he did such a good job setting things up that it would be unnecessary for him to do anything else after he created. Well, one of the problems I have with this is that that's not the way nature looks to me. There are many gaps in nature. The origin of living cells, or the origin of life, of course, is one of the big ones that is universally recognized. But there are others, the origin of meiosis and sexual reproduction, another difficulty for evolutionary theory, the origin of development and multicellularity, the origin of mind and consciousness is one that's being looked at a lot today. And if, in fact, God put into the atoms the natural tendency to form living beings, how could it be possible for those living beings to die? I mean, if the atoms are pushing toward life, death ought to be impossible. And furthermore, just think of what kind of a God who spends all that time and energy planning this. Why wouldn't he be interested in watching it and following and caring for it afterwards? So to me, that idea it does not work scientifically or theologically. It just doesn't work. The second idea is that God acts somehow through what we might call providence. In other words, not something that we can follow, but he's in there making a difference. His actions are undetectable to us and constrained by natural law. Well, some of the problems with that theory, if natural law is enough, then why do you propose that there's a God somewhere? The God seems to be an extra, unnecessary. Secondly, the fossil record has many gaps in sudden appearances. The fossil record does not show continuity. And to think that God is causing this gradual change through very subtle, undetectable changes or activities does not match up with what we see in the fossil record, and it doesn't match up with what we see in genetics. If God is causing change, genetic change to cause evolution, why do we have so many people with genetic diseases? That does not seem to me to be a valid picture of a creator. So that leaves us with one more, which I'll call evolutionary creation. We could call it some other name, I suppose. In this view, God is actually directly involved. There doesn't need to be subtle, but God is directly involved. He's causing mutations. He's maybe directing selection. He's perhaps creatively mutating genomes in order to produce a new species or a new type of organism. And so in this view, what we see in the fossil record is a record of God's laboratory, his experimental tinkering. Well, there are some problems with this too. The fossil sequence does not appear to reflect a continuous process. There are gaps. In fact, the fossil record is a record of gaps. Someone once commented and says, why is it that evolution always, when people study evolution in one particular geographic locality, they look at the fossil record and they always find that there's just not much there. And so the explanation is, well, the evolution is going on somewhere else, and then the organisms that evolved somewhere else are migrating back into this area, so they're leaving a gap, a morphological gap or evolutionary gap. And someone asked, well, why is it that wherever we look, evolution is always happening somewhere else? Why can't we ever catch it? Well, maybe the evolution is not the explanation. The fossil sequence does not appear to be intelligently guided, and genetic diseases do not appear to be divinely directed. So I have difficulty with this theory because it doesn't seem to match up with what we observe, and it doesn't seem to be efficient. Now, when we look at biblical creation and compare it with any of these evolutionary creationists, we see perhaps behind the scenes some principles that should be instructive. In biblical creation, the basis of this idea is the divine revelation in the Bible. On the other hand, the idea of evolutionary creation or theistic evolution, this is based on natural theology and human discovery. Now, what do I mean by natural theology? Natural theology is the idea that we can learn about God's nature, the kind of God he is, by looking at nature. So when we see, for example, the beauty of the flower, we see a God who loves beauty. And when we see the venom of the snake, of the viper, we see a God who likes violence, and so on. And all the problem of evil gets into our theology there as part of what God is doing. And the Bible describes that nature, although originally created by God, nature has become corrupted. In Genesis 6, God gives the reason for bringing the flood, and the reason that is given there is that all the earth had become corrupted and violent, and God brought the flood on to put an end to the corruption and violence, or at least to slow it down. So that should be sufficient explanation as to why we cannot base our theology on what we see in nature. In biblical creation, death is an enemy caused by sin. That's how the Bible describes death. It was brought in, if we read Romans 5 and Romans 8. But in evolutionary creation, death is needed for progress. One of the principles of evolutionary biology that was emphasized by Ernst Mayr, the former, he's deceased now, but he lived to be 100 years old and was considered to be the most influential evolutionary biologist of his time. He said, remember, individuals do not evolve, only populations evolve. And what that means is that evolution can only occur when some individuals die and others survive. Death is absolutely required for evolution. But death is identified as an enemy in Scripture. In biblical creation, we have the principle of compassion for the weak. Very strong. God reproved his people many times for not caring for the weak. But in evolutionary theory, the weak should be eliminated. And you saw in the previous talk how Darwinian principles are applied in social situations to justify elimination of the weak. In biblical creation, truthfulness is an important feature. The Bible is based on truthfulness of God, the Creator. But in evolutionary creation, truthfulness is not a valued thing. Many organisms increase their fitness by deception. It's not important to be true, it's important that something work. It's important to be fit, so to speak, to produce many offspring. In biblical creation, righteousness comes by faith. In evolutionary creation, righteousness is a matter of progressive improvement, which boils down to righteousness by works. In biblical creation, it's based on life. Evolutionary creation is based on death. When you think about these principles, you see that the life and mission of Jesus Christ demonstrated those principles. If you look at these principles, you will see that these fit the characteristics of the enemy. And so we can perhaps identify who is pushing this agenda. We should be warned, and the reason I mention these things is because the idea of evolutionary creation is being urged upon Seventh-day Adventists and other Christians. And I think we need to take warning. Evolutionary theory places human reason above divine revelation. Evolutionary theory implies that God himself is evil, and evolutionary theory does not fit with the story of Jesus. There are numerous problems with intermediate models, that is, God's activity in long ages. Who are Adam and Eve in these other theories? What was the effect of Adam's sin or fall on nature? If the Genesis story is not the way it appears to be, if in fact there was no six-day creation, then we have no record of any ancestors for the human species. Adam and Eve become metaphorical figures and not real. In most cases, some people will produce an explanation that can somehow include them, but it's not based on any revelation, it's just made up. And if if Adam did not actually live as a historical individual and did not actually sin, then death and suffering are not the result of human sin. And if that's the case, then what did Jesus do when he came here to earth? What's the meaning of his life? What is the issue of salvation? Creationists sometimes get criticized for a God of the gaps approach, but I think that God of the gaps applies strongly to theories of evolutionary creation, because basically the whole idea of evolutionary creation is that whatever happened, somehow God did it. We don't have any record of how he did it. We don't even have any record that he did it in Scripture, but just the idea is that somehow, well, if you find a fossil here, well, that shows us what God did. Well, that's completely God of the gaps approach. A God of the gaps, what that means is that anytime you come to a question you can't answer, you just say, oh, God did it that way. Well, there are times when we have no recourse, perhaps, but when we have a whole theory built on that, I think we probably have a very weak theory. And here we come to what I think are some very important points. When we look at all these models of origins, we find that there is no known model of origins that provides answers to all of our questions. No matter what you believe, you run into some challenges. There's issues that make you wonder, how do we deal with these circumstances, with these issues? None of the long-age models enjoys any experimental support or biblical support. So scientifically, the only scientific relief one gets is simply the matter of time. But in terms of the mechanisms and the processes, science is not satisfied. We do not get scientific support there. So if we are to say, well, if there's anything that science objects in our model, we'll get a different model, then we're not going to have a model at all, because there are no models that science leaves untouched. Now, perhaps we can explain that by noting that the theory of creation in Scripture is a supernatural theory. And science refuses to use any supernatural activity to explain anything. So would you expect to be able to explain a supernatural event without using any reference to supernatural activity? Probably not. I don't believe that biblical creation faces any problems that are greater than the resources it's based on. In other words, the resources it's based on is the omnipotence of the Creator. And so, regardless of what question or challenge science may bring to us, the God that's described in Scripture has, by his very nature, the ability to solve any of the problems, whether we can figure it out or not. This is not true for evolutionary theory, which has only natural law as its resources to explain things. And there are too many things that natural law does not explain to justify the acceptance of evolutionary theory. And biblical creation is the only model consistent with Scripture and the character and life of Jesus Christ. Gibson and Yerxa wrote a book called Species of Origins, in which they examined many of these concepts that I have described, and they came to the conclusion similar to what I have come to, although their belief is a different direction than my own. The various via media, in other words, attempts to blend long age and creation. The various via media positions are attempting to reconcile viewpoints that are, in their simplest form, contradictory. Supernaturalism compared to naturalism are simply contradictory principles. These two perspectives, science and religion, can have at best some kind of uneasy truce. They can never be reconciled. Well, I'm not so sure that they can never be reconciled. I think they can be eventually, but at the present time we are not doing it successfully. We have challenges that we have questions for, and we do not know how to resolve them. This is a repeat of what I've already said. There's a difference between the materialistic philosophy undergirding evolutionary theory and the supernaturalistic presuppositions of any form of creation. Does this make science our enemy? No. Let's be quick to say science is not our enemy. Science has revealed just a part of the magnificent design and the vast intelligence and technological skills of the Creator. It's amazing to see in nature what science has revealed and think, how did this come into being? The person who put this into place must be extremely intelligent and very technologically skillful. But the conflict arises when God acts with purposes in our world and science tries to explain everything without a purpose. That isn't going to work very well. But despite this bias of the materialists, we still see wonderful evidence for God's design in nature. Now, our mission as a church is to tell the story of Jesus. I presume we'd all agree with that. But when we think of the models of origins that come to us for our judgment, a very important criteria should be, how does the story of Jesus fit in this model? And as far as I can tell, the farther away we go from biblical creation, the worse is the fit of the life and teachings of Jesus. The gospel is based on the premise that God created us better than we are now, and that we have fallen away from Him. God sent His Son to restore us. Any theory of origins that denies that death is the result of sin is logically inconsistent with the scripture, with the gospel, because the gospel has to do with being redeemed from sin. So here's some conclusions. First, we must admit and acknowledge that our understanding of creation is based on faith in Scripture. It's not based on science. We don't expect to base our understanding of creation on science. Secondly, we must acknowledge that at present our understanding of the Bible and our understanding of science are in tension. We have some areas of disagreement. We don't know how to explain them, particularly in terms of the age, the time involved. That's a challenge for us. And we need to continue to explore the world of nature, the science, in order to improve our understanding of nature in a manner that is consistent with Scriptures and maintain a knowledge of the issues that are likely to impact our witness to the gospel. When we witness to others, science is a very important influence and a very important factor. We need to understand it. We must continue to study the Scriptures also to seek to understand to expand our understanding of its teaching. Maybe we don't understand Scripture perfectly. Perhaps we need to study it more. And of course, whether we understand it or not, we need to study it more. It's a wonderful blessing to read Scripture, to read especially of the life of Jesus. But many other parts of Scripture have been discovered by generations of people to be very much a blessing. We must adopt an attitude of humility as we work together to try to understand what God expects of us. So let us not go out with the idea that we know everything. Let's recognize that we don't know everything, but we are not going to improve our situation by rejecting biblical creation and adopting one of the other models. It would be a tragic irony if we rejected the biblical model because of its scientific problems and adopted another model that also has scientific problems, but more than that, has a multitude of theological problems. All right, thank you very much for your participation.